Hello, and welcome to Governing in a Time of Chaos, board meetings in the age of COVID and CRT. If you're watching this event, then you understand how contentious school board meetings have become in California and across the country. And you also realize how problematic this is for school boards that are trying hard to do their business on behalf of students and on behalf of the communities they serve. The purpose of this event is to try and provide you with information to help you mitigate the hostility in board meetings so you can do that important work on behalf of California's public school students. We have a great group of panelists here today and a lot of important information to discuss. But before we get into the heart of the meeting, I'd like to present a few housekeeping details so you can participate in the question and answer session of today's event. You should all see a dashboard or a module. For most of you, it'll be in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. There are several gray menu boxes. If you go about 3/4 of the way down the dashboard, one of those boxes is labeled questions and has an arrow pointing to the right. If you click on that arrow so that it's pointing downward, a question box will expand. And you will enter your question into that box the same way as you would type an email or type a text. You click enter or send, and that message will be transmitted to staff behind the scenes. We will receive the question. We'll try to get to all of them, but we probably won't have time. If we're not able to answer your question during the event, we will answer it directly after today's event. So with that, I would like to introduce some of the people who will be speaking today and giving you the information that you need. I'm Troy Flint, the Chief Information Officer for CSBA. We also have Vernon M. Billy, the CEO and Executive Director of the California School Boards Association. We're honored to have a special guest, Dr. Naomi Bardach, who is lead for California's Safe Schools for All team. Meg Cathuli, who is a trustee in the Los Alamitos Unified School District and also a director of the California School Boards Association. We have Cindy Gardner, who's a trustee in the Rim of the World School District and also a delegate for CSBA. From Oakland Unified School District, we have their general counsel, Josh Daniels. And from CSBA's Crisis Communications Group, the Donovan Group, we have Jerry Gallagher, who is a partner with that firm. We also have one of CSBA's governance educator and consultants who happens to double as a trustee in the Fall River Unified School District. That's Terry Vigil. And last but certainly not least, we have Keith Bray, General Counsel and Chief of Staff for CSBA. And before we go to our panelists, I'd like to hear a special statement from CSBA CEO and Executive Director Vernon M. Billy.
Thank you, Troy, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us for this special webinar, Governing in a Time of Chaos. You know, this is not the type of webinar that we'd like to be doing. We'd much rather be focusing on student achievement, school funding, or any number of other issues directly related to public education. Unfortunately, as we've read the news and listened to firsthand accounts from many of our members, it was evident that we had to do something and we had to do it now. Everywhere you turn, school and county board members are being accosted and harassed merely performing their duties and fulfilling their obligation to uphold the law. While school boards are used to lots of public engagement, the hostility we've seen over the last few months is unprecedented for sure and concerning on multiple levels. Board members have been verbally and physically assaulted, received death threats against them and their families, have been forced to abandon board meetings because of disruptions, and in some cases have had to hire extra security for protection. In many cases, the disruption stems from anger with state-imposed and required COVID-19 mitigation strategies like masking, testing, and vaccinations. In others, debates over critical race theory or ethnic studies are fueling the local conflict. Regardless of the reasons, it's clear that it is harder to be a school trustee now than it ever has been before. But this isn't just about a loss of civility or the fact that some board members feel unsafe, although that would be enough. The bigger problem is that the current environment is hindering the ability of boards to do what they've been elected to do, and that is to serve our students. Your mission to educate students is too important to be derailed by those who want to stop the work of boards, which is why it's critical that boards develop techniques for effective community engagement and productive board meetings, even in this time of chaos. It is my hope that this webinar will provide the information, strategies, and resources needed to help mitigate adult conflict so that you can focus on the needs of students. With that, I just want to say thank you for your time and for joining us today, and I'll turn it back over to Troy so we can get started. Troy.
Thanks, Vernon, for that very important message. As you mentioned in your comments, the main issue that is fueling these contentious board meetings is disagreement or lack of understanding about COVID-19 mitigation strategies. So to provide us with more information and background that can hopefully help influence this discussion in a positive direction, we have Dr. Naomi Bardach, who is the lead of California's Safe Schools for All team. Naomi?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and thank you for the invitation. And I will do my best to give you guys as much information as I can to sort of help put the context there. And I will offer also to be available to folks. Our Safe Schools team in general has a lot of technical assistance available to support people with any questions that are coming up that would be helpful for you guys as you continue to have these conversations. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Sohail Sood. He's the co-lead for the Safe Schools for All team. He contributed to the slides today. He's an associate professor of pediatrics at UCSF and just joined us this summer. He's a terrific asset as well. So you'll be seeing him a little bit in addition in the future. And next slide. So just to set the stage, what is the overall school endeavor in the pandemic? We're always learning more, and it's the commitment that I bring, it's the commitment that Dr. Sood brings to what we do, which is continue to focus on using evidence to understand how to achieve the safe and successful schools. So there's these twin goals, which always require a balance, because there's safety, which is, the rules, the mitigation, all of the work that we need to do in order to keep the schools safe. And then there's also success, making sure though that kids are still able to be in seats, in school, in-person instruction. And so trying to hold both those things at once is always a challenge, and it's always where we go back to the evidence to try to understand what is the right way to do both those things, safety and success. And we know that throughout the pandemic, there has been advocacy on both sides, people saying, I don't feel safe to go back, and people saying, why haven't we gone back earlier? And that's much of what you are holding. And so we're trying to bring to you guys as much as you can the evidence, but also the rationale behind the safety mitigation layers that sort of are the public health recommendations. Next slide. So just to give a little bit of context data, what's our current outlook? What's going on? 90% of new cases in California are the Delta variant. You can see the slide from the winter surge is that really big peak, and then there's a much lower peak, which is what we're seeing right now. And we're seeing that the growth in this peak is actually slowing. We're actually coming down on the other side of the peak for Delta, which is really good news. We're still in the surge, but it is looking like we're coming out of it a little bit. But schools, of course, right now are planning, actively doing mitigation efforts because we're in this elevated time. And the slide with California, Florida, Texas, and US is just to highlight that we have to learn a lot from the experience nationally. You can see that the very, very high rates are in those states that have not as much of an emphasis on vaccination, so lower rates of vaccination, and are actively banning any mask requirements in schools. And this is where the rates of cases in children are going really, really high in those other states. What we're doing in California is to try to avoid that situation in the Delta, in the age of Delta. Next slide. And it's true also in terms of schools. How does that play out in schools? So you can see that this is a map from a place called Burbio. It's actually a really very interesting and helpful resource that shows school closures throughout the country. And it's this is a snapshot as of yesterday, showing a lot of school closures in many of those places that have no mask. Mask mandates are not allowed, they're banned, as well as low vaccination rates. In contrast, you can see that California has very few school closures, and I give credit to the high rate of vaccination, the fact that there is universal masking required, also the modified quarantine, I think, is helping students stay in school, and all the efforts that people are doing on the ground to really help support safe and successful schools. Next slide. So this two slides are basically to help give sort of the idea that, like, what is the essential rationale for how do we keep schools safe? Why do we use these layers? It's helpful to remember how might schools even contribute to transmission? The whole reason we shut down schools initially is because we were worried they were going to lead to cases in students and staff and family members at home. They would drive community transmission. Well, how would that happen? And how do we think about making sure that we keep things safe by preventing those things happen? The first step is that there has to be virus in our community. The second step would be the virus would come onto the school campus. The third step, it would get transmitted in school campus from one person to another. And the fourth step is that that person who got infected in school would then bring it back out to the community. Next slide, please. So the interventions that we have, vaccines work on step 1 and step 4. So decrease the amount of virus in the community and protect the people outside of school. Step 2, decreasing virus in school. How do we do that? Testing. If your case rates are high in your community, which is sort of true in almost all of California right now, testing is your friend. It can be very helpful for identifying cases, preventing outbreaks on campus. And also another key piece that we're learning is stay home when sick is actually an important learning, which is if you have symptoms of COVID, it's possible that you have it, and staying home and getting tested is really important. It doesn't mean stay home for 10 days, just get that test to make sure that somebody is negative. And then the last box is the in-school transmission. How do we prevent that in-school transmission? Masking. You know, masking is simple, straightforward approach that is evidence-based. And then ventilation. We know that the more we can make the indoors act like the outdoors in terms of keeping air circulated and clean can actually be very, very helpful in preventing in-school transmission. Next slide, please. Some people like the Swiss cheese model presentation. So this is where you have to understand also in many schools and school board conversations might find this a helpful analogy, which is that these layers, every layer is slightly imperfect. There's a hole potentially where a virus could get through. There is no perfect layer that blocks everything completely, but when you take them together and you churn the Swiss cheese layers, then you can prevent the virus from getting through and prevent the in-school transmission. So what are those layers? Vaccination for everybody, testing and stay home when sick, masking indoors and the hand hygiene, and then improving air quality in the indoors or using your outdoors for activities like eating and other things that where you can't keep the masks on. Next slide, please. Hot topic, how have things changed with the Delta variant? We know that Delta is 2 times more contagious as previous variants. It's leading to the current surge of infections. We see it nationally. We also see it in California, just increased transmissibility. When people were talking earlier about the mask, whether or not the mask requirement needed to be enforced, part of the lessons that are really important is that enforcement is not really an option. Either schools enforce or Delta is going to enforce. We've seen that nationally and we've seen that locally. Delta is going to transmit if we're not doing good layers in place in schools. In terms of virulence and severity of symptoms, the jury is still out. It doesn't really look like Delta is any more serious in kids than it is in adults, but we're watching the data very carefully about that. Vaccine effectiveness, yes, the vaccines are still effective against Delta. Less than 1% of vaccinated people experience what's called a breakthrough infection, which is you've been vaccinated, but you still get Delta. which though is helpful for people to remember. If you know 100+ people who have gotten vaccinated, which most of us probably do, you are likely to know somebody who's had a breakthrough infection, but very, 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 very few, less than 0.005% of COVID hospitalizations have been vaccinated people. People who are unvaccinated are 11 times more likely to get COVID. So vaccines are still a very key layer in the time of Delta. Next slide, please. This is just a brief image from a study that you might have heard about recently, and so I just want to bring it up and talk about it briefly, which is it was an outbreak in a Marin elementary school. And you can see it was actually all Delta. It happened in May, and I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the teacher's desk at the front of the room, it was a teacher was the index case who was unvaccinated and took off the teacher's mask during class to do reading out loud. It was a second grade classroom. The whole first row got infected. This one is infected, but just not symptomatic. 3 people in the second row. 1 person in the third, 1 person in the fourth, and then 2 in the back. So this is Delta. It transmits very effectively. The key lessons learned, masking, vaccination, really important pieces. And the last lesson from this study, which I don't show, but if you're interested, you can look more at the study, is that they had a very high rate of vaccination in their community. So there was an outbreak in this class, but it didn't actually go very far forward after the particular students got infected. So that's an important piece also, is that the effect of the wraparound vaccination in our communities can also be very helpful. Next slide. Next slide. So a couple early lessons learned. Number one, we're seeing, as schools are opening, what are we learning? The school-associated cases, which is cases that we're finding in the school context because people are doing testing, is different than in-school transmission. And we're finding that those school-associated cases are often caused by non-school social events. A suburban school experienced high levels of cases due to a back-to-school party held the week before school. So a couple examples of that. And so the lesson learned there and the implications for you guys is like, help communicate, guys. Outside of school affects inside of school. So keep on your mask, follow the things, pay attention to what you're doing outside of school as well, so you don't put school at risk. Pattern number 2, cases are caused by symptomatic individuals who went to school while sick. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that teacher also had symptoms when the teacher was teaching in the classroom. They had a runny nose, they thought it was allergies, and then they went to class anyway for 2 days while they had symptoms and then spiked a fever on the 3rd day. So again, telling people it's a very common story in healthcare and in schools. People say, oh, I thought it was just my allergies. So educate people about that. Don't come to school if you're having any kind of symptoms, including what you think might be allergies. Go get tested first. Pattern number 3, independent study questions regarding quarantine and payment is leading to some confusion. They just had a statutory amendment passed on Friday to clarify that. There was information sent out from the California Department of Education, which I won't review today because limited time, but certainly if you have any questions, you can reach out either to us or to the California Department of Education describing those statutory changes. And the take-home point is that payment can start for what's called short-term independent study, which includes quarantining. People will get paid for that, schools can get paid for that, and the payment can start on day 1. Next slide, please. Next slide. So staffing shortages are caused by low rates of vaccination among staff. So that is something that we're hearing. Really important that people get vaccinated, the teachers get vaccinated as much as you can support that in your communities. I think that can be helpful, and it will help school operations is what we're hearing on the ground. Pattern number 5 is expanded demand for testing to prevent outbreaks. So there are multiple school districts right now, particularly because of the Delta surge, people want to ramp up their testing. So it's taking some additional time. If you think you might want to have any testing in your community, we encourage people to sign up now, learn about it now, get things started as soon as you can, because it will take a couple weeks to get everything in place. And then the last one is schools are adjusting to their modified quarantine practices. So that's a learning, the learning curve to figure out how to do that. It's a new piece of the guidance that was supported by CDC, so California is also doing it. But the really good news is that it does seem to be contributing to keeping kids in school. And so I'll talk about modified quarantine in the next slide. So just briefly, throughout the pandemic, quarantine was recommended for anyone who had been within 6 feet of a positive case for 15 minutes or more. There's a modified rule this year, which is that allows for what's called a modified quarantine, where students can remain in class after a possible exposure if both people were wearing masks, the exposed student remains asymptomatic, no symptoms, not even your allergy symptoms, the exposed student undergoes twice weekly testing and refrains from their extracurricular activities. And the basic idea is like, we want to support maximizing instructional time based on the evidence of what we learned last year, knowing that masking and testing create additional safety layers. A couple tips for implementation: expand that testing capacity to meet that testing recommendation and allow that to happen much easier if you can do it on the school site rather than trying to send kids out to their regular doctors. If you haven't yet, establishing seating charts is what we've heard really helpful to track exposures, particularly in the high schools, but even the elementary schools and of course the middle schools. There's also a decision tree, which I've linked there, and you guys will get these slides, which is now available from CDPH, that helps you understand, like, is somebody eligible for modified quarantine or not? And then stable groups can also help limit the number of students exposed, which right now is in Delta is causing some trouble for some of the schools when there's lots and lots of kids being exposed because they're going to many different classes. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to finish with just to highlight a couple resources. So I'm not going through all these slides. I just wanted to let you guys know testing, as I already mentioned. Take advantage of the state resources. The state can help at no cost, including kits, technical assistance, software for registration, consenting, reporting, and dashboards back to the schools. There's the link there to get started. Next slide, please. For staffing, there's a couple things just to support staffing. I know it's a struggle, or I've heard it's a struggle across the state. Ensuring that staff are vaccinated or tested weekly, that can really support staff staying in school. Employing the guidance for vaccinated people. If you're vaccinated, then they don't need to quarantine if they're asymptomatic, so you don't lose that staffing. Next slide, please. And then finally, if there's an outbreak in your community, the state has what's called strike teams available that provides testing and vaccinations if desired for schools that are having active outbreaks. The testing can help, again, with that modified quarantine, so bringing in a bunch of testing resources if you haven't already set them up, that strike team is available. There's some limitation in how many strike teams we have, so we encourage you to set up that testing, but this is an important resource that has helped to prevent some school closures throughout the state in the last couple of weeks. And I think that's my last slide. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, just vaccines. Authorization for ages 5 to 11 are expected by late fall. So we are, that's something to be looking like will be coming in the future. And next slide. And so if you're interested in setting up a school located clinic, if you feel like your community is going to be interested in doing that, supporting the schools to do it, there's a lot of resources for how to do that. And we've heard from families that having a school-based clinic is really meaningful for them. It's accessible in their community. They trust the school as a site. And so to the extent you want to really support getting that vaccination to the 5 to 11-year-olds, that would be something to be considering doing as we see when the vaccinations are going to become available. Next slide. And just to end, this is our schools hub, which provides a website for technical assistance. You can see school administrators and what they call LHDs, local health departments, that start your request piece is a way to request technical assistance, and you see the URL at the bottom. And I have one slide, but you can skip that one and move on to the next presenter. Thank you so much. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bardach. We appreciate that thorough presentation. I'm sure it will be of great help to our school districts and county offices of education. Speaking of which, we have an esteemed representative from one of CSBA's local districts, Meg Cathuli, who is a trustee on the Los Alamitos Unified School District in Orange County, as well as a director of the California School Boards Association. Meg is going to talk to us about some of the experiences she has had personally in her local district as they have tried to communicate some of this information and been grappling with the feedback and response to that. Meg?
I've been on this board for 21 years and I've done many, many things. I've hired superintendents, I passed facility bonds, I weathered the Great Recession, and then I closed schools in March due to COVID-19. But now the misinformation and emotions that are coming from our communities is like nothing I have ever experienced. Governing our schools in the time of COVID and in critical race theory is a challenge, and it is something that I don't think any of us signed up to tackle. Last spring, my district was approving the curriculum for our elective, and I hope you heard elective in capital letters, elective ethnic studies class. The process was started because we had requests from students, parents, and community members. We followed our normal procedures whenever we add another class offering to our high school. That was when we started having people come to our board, our board meetings to complain that we were teaching critical race theory. No matter how many times we tried to explain that we weren't teaching CRT, we were still called Marxists, child abusers, and anti-American. And we will all be recalled because our behavior is so egregious. It seemed that no matter what we said, people don't listen. They only want to make their point. They'll disregard any facts or any science that is presented. They have not come to the school board meeting to get information. At one point, it became so contentious that we were advised by our local police authority to hold our meeting virtually due to the chatter that they heard on social media. We have had people from out of our area coming and speaking to us and accusing us of many different misbehaviors. But we also have people in our community who support a very conservative philosophy. These groups are now working together, are organized, and have a larger agenda. So how do we handle our board meetings so that we can allow public comment and still get our work done? You need to be very consistent in the running of your board meetings. If you handle public comment the same way every time, eventually people will come to accept it. After having problems at meetings, we decided we needed to take control. We now read this statement, which I will read to you before each time we have public comment at a board meeting. We say, the board welcomes comment from the public. It is the opportunity to provide public comment on agenda items or items not on the agenda. Persons wishing to address the board must complete a speaker request card. Comment cards may be submitted to the district office anytime after 9 a.m. the day of the meeting and will be accepted until the start of the meeting. Each speaker is limited to a maximum of 3 minutes. Public comment is for a total of 30 minutes. No speaker may relinquish his or her time to another. Speakers are requested to address the board from the podium, state their name, and adhere to the time limits. The board may not take any action or discuss any item not appearing on the posted agenda and cannot immediately respond to public comments. So that stops a lot of the heckling from the crowd when everything is working properly. We came up with this statement with our help of legal advice and observing the behavior of our speakers. If our speakers go over their time limit, we try to let them finish their sentence, but we turn off their mic, thank them very much, and call the next speaker. It isn't always quiet when we do this, but people need to know that this is our procedure and we don't deviate from it. We do frequently, and it's like almost always, extend our total time for public comment. My board feels it is very important to allow a speaker a chance to address the board. But if we have more than 13 speakers, we make a motion to extend our total time to allow everyone to speak, but each speaker only has 2 minutes. And I could see if you were actually in a situation where you had maybe 40 or 50 people who want to speak to you, you can just cut them down to 1 minute and know they won't be happy, but you might get home before midnight if you do that. This works pretty well when things are going okay. What you do when emotions are running high and people are shouting at you and no one is listening to anyone. Our police came to our meeting in plain clothes, probably thinking that a uniformed officer could incite a situation. But you still need to control the room. Taking a break and leaving the room for 10 or 15 minutes helps to calm the situation, but you need to be gone long enough to show that you're serious. And then you do it again if the rowdiness continues. Hiring private security guards with huge security written on the back of their shirts, so everybody knows who they are, can help. and you need to be very aware of what could possibly be happening outside of the building at all times. You need to have a staff member there who has the authority to make a decision if something should happen. And this really breaks my heart, but you have to be able to protect your students, whether they support the ethnic studies class or not, whether they're just happy to be back in class with their friends, or if they feel that wearing a mask sucks all the air out of the room. They need to be heard and they need to be protected. Some district adult, but not a parent, needs to be with them. We have had adults approach our students, intimidate them, and say inappropriate things to them. So please, please have a plan in place to help support your students. You will find that there are people all around that think you're continually making huge mistakes, and they're not hesitant to tell you about it. You'll receive 10 emails a day from these people, and they'll wonder why you haven't responded within 15 minutes. So where did your supporters go? Where did the people who originally asked you to take care of our children and to delve deeper into different studies that could benefit everyone? They're still there, but they just don't come out and tell you about it as often as the people who are complaining about your horrible behavior. You will receive these supportive emails. You'll be thanked for standing strong for the students. People who feel unseen and unheard will appreciate the recognition that you are giving them. And the whole mask issue will give you a glimmer into lives of people who deal with health issues on a daily basis. Most people don't want to get involved in this mess. They may have children in the same sport teams or in the same clubs. They don't want to turn their life into one confrontation after another. I guess that's why board members were elected. So why are we doing this as board members? Why are we putting up with this? Why are we putting ourselves out there? I think you have the answer in your heart. Why did you originally run for the school board? What was that burning question that you had to answer in your heart? And to our administrators, why did you go into education in the first place? To help every child succeed? To make the future better for everyone? Or maybe even selfishly, because you wanted to have a positive impact on the world by supporting students and making the future better. Well, we are doing that. We just need to hang tough and keep our hearts and our minds in the right place. Thank you so much. Back to you, Troy.
Thank you for those heartfelt words, Meg. We really appreciate that perspective, and we'd like to supplement that with another perspective from a local school board member. Coming to us today from Rim of the World, where she is a trustee and also a CSBA delegate, is Cindy Gardner.
Good morning, everyone. I am not going to repeat what Meg said. That's redundant and we all get bored. So with that, I want to start with some things that you can do proactively. As Meg said, you can write on your agenda what is your policy for the board comments. We also add a decorum piece, and I'll read just a little bit of it. The governing board is interested in the ideas and opinions of all stakeholders and endeavors to incorporate community views into its deliberations and decisions. At the same time, it must be able to conduct its business in an organized and efficient manner, free from material disruption. Therefore, in accordance with Board Bylaw 9323 and Government Code Section 54957.9, audience members may not disrupt, disturb, or otherwise impede the orderly conduct of this meeting. So it goes on a couple more sentences, but we do try to be proactive in our expectations. We don't have right now heavy CRT or ethnic studies opponents or proponents at our meetings, although we do have questions out in the community, and we use the CSBA FAQ sheet on both of those to try to give the correct information on what CRT is and isn't. What we're having right now is the awesome mask. We have a strong, small, relatively small, but very loud parent community who do not want masks worn in the schools. And they are on Facebook. They are organizing. They are using the Let Them Breathe organization and their guidelines to send us emails, to push us to pass a resolution to send to the governor to repeal or exempt us from the mask mandate. Our August board meeting was a bit of an example of all the issues that boards experience in any of these areas of CRT, ethnic studies, or the mask and vaccination mandate. Well, vaccines aren't mandated, but what people think they're going to be. So right off the bat, our superintendent in our district has a great relationship with our sheriff department. So at our August meeting, we had 3 sheriffs to be able to control any misbehavior. The parent group did protest in front of our high school where we hold our meetings at 4:30, and then they came into our board meeting unmasked with students, unmasked, and there were about 50 or 60 of them, which is pretty large size for our meeting room. We then had a statement read by our board president that was worked out in advance with a communications consultant and our superintendent, telling them that masks are required, it's a state mandate, etc. During public comments, unfortunately, she had to remind everybody about the masks, and most of them, pretty much all of them, chose not to mask up. So as a result, I know the concern is, one, sitting there and allowing people to not wear masks in your meeting when it's a state mandate, there are negative consequences for you as a board, because you're giving basically passive permission. Hey, yeah, don't wear a mask. So what we, and you as a board, you're responsible for the safety of your students and your staff. And we have principals and cabinets at our board, cabinet members at our board meetings. So with those two really disheartening ideas, we decided that our September meeting would be held via Zoom, virtually. That group of parents did not like it. They had to submit their comments in advance of the board meeting, and the comments were read by our board president. But we decided that the safest place to hold our meeting was via Zoom. So that's what we chose to do. In regards to handling our public comments, we also, like Meg, voted 2/3 to extend the time limit for public comments on the mask comments. And we also decided, because there were only 7 speakers at the time, no, sorry, that was in our September meeting. We chose to reduce the time limit from 5 minutes per speaker down to 3 minutes per speaker. And that way we had everybody say what they wanted to say, and take the level of animosity in the room down a bit. Remember, just want to let you know, we are a small community. As you see on our ADA, we know everybody in the community. We're stopped in the grocery stores, so we tend to know everybody in the audience for the most part. So it helps to read the room, so to speak, and do what will help bring down that animosity in your board meeting. What works for us may not work for you. Then what we did is that our board president did remind people as they were exceeding their time limit to finish up. If someone doesn't, you can warn that person a couple times to finish, and then they turn off the microphone, but you can adjourn and take a break. You can announce everyone that you're taking a 5-minute, 10-minute break, and you can announce, oh, Jane Smith is going to be coming to the mic next to express her public comments. So that is a way that you can kind of control that. Our superintendent, because we did have some people express that one person was getting to talk longer than the other person, she is buying a timer for our next in-person board meeting so that everybody can see exactly how much time everybody is speaking. So that is one way to be proactive if you're getting those grumblings in your board meeting. If you are having disruptions in your board meeting and you cannot conduct the business of the district, you can warn people once, twice, 3 times, and then you can clear the room with the help of whether it's security guards, private security, or your sheriffs to clear the room and then go forward with conducting your board meeting. If you cannot do that, you can adjourn the meeting and then resume it via Zoom or in a different location. But it's really important that you keep the focus on the education of your children and all of those decisions that you need to make on behalf of the district moving forward, making sure that you approve that field trip for the volleyball team for an overnight weekend tournament. So you just want to make sure that you are conducting board business. And people may say, well, that's not transparent. Well, according to Brown Act, you are allowed to be able to move forward with your meeting without disruption. And Keith Bray will talk more about all of that in his section of this presentation. I also want to say that you want to make sure that you are being very proactive as you go forward with your stories, knowing that CRT or masks were going to become a problem. We did a lot of education pieces prior to that. Our superintendent does a lot of press releases, a lot of updates on mandates and the latest news. She also does spotlight on education and every aspect, whether it's a school or a specific department, has a spotlight, and they get to share positive news, whether it's a program or activity or whatever that is. We try to create positive stories. Our board uses our board comments to educate, whether it's on the budget pieces that we know are going to hit our budget. We're in declining enrollment by 5% basically annually, and it's affecting our budget. Our unduplicated count is only about 58%. So we use our board comments for that. We use our board comments to ask for advocacy. We use our board comments to reiterate the state mandate and our role in enforcing that and the negative consequences for us if we don't follow the state mandate. So we really use a combination of elements to be proactive, and then we have a set of tools during the meeting to control the meeting. We unfortunately did have a gentleman in our August meeting who went a little far. Threats were made and specifically to one teacher, which was very unfortunate. And what was wonderful though is when she went down the hill, we live on a mountain, to obtain a restraining order against the gentleman, our superintendent and our associate superintendent went with her to be that support for her. We can do that in our community. We're a smaller school district, and it went a long way as a message to our teachers that we have your back. We care about you. We want to ease your fear as you try to enforce the mask mandate in your classroom. So we try to do as much as we can to support our teachers. And it's just a tough time right now. The masks we know are becoming just a flashpoint for everybody. Yes, our board was called names that were killing children by making them wear these masks, and we are impeding their development. And you have to sit there and take it. You have to put on your board face. You cannot interact with them. Do not interact with a public speaker. Don't try to correct them if they're giving out information or calling you liars or any of that. Don't ask for clarifying questions. Let them speak. Let them get done. And if there's someone who's making threats that are super specific, use your attorney to follow up after the meeting. So you just really need to make sure you're not antagonizing the speaker, antagonizing the room. You really want to stay within the tools that you've been given by your attorneys, by CSBA, to manage your meeting. And if it just is out of control, clear the room so you can do the business of your kids, because that's the most important thing. That is why we're here. This is why we are school board members or superintendents or educators. We want the best for our kids. And if we cannot do what's best for our kids, then we need to make sure that we create the environment and we create the boundaries to be able to do our business for kids. So that is all I have to say. You're more than welcome to ask me questions later if you want to know something else. But otherwise, I'm throwing it back to Troy. Go, boy.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I appreciate those remarks, and I'm sure they're informative to our members. We have one more perspective from the local level, this one with a slightly different twist. At the local level, your general counsel or other legal resources can be very important in letting you know what is and is not permissible in terms of trying to generate a more productive meeting and get control of some of these contentious encounters. Josh Daniels is the general counsel in the Oakland Unified School District, and he's going to talk about some of the measures they've put in place.
Thank you, Troy, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. Everything that Meg and Cindy said, I just want to reiterate, particularly the part about starting off with a script. There is a script that we use in Oakland. Previous to this, I actually served as a school board member in Berkeley, and when I served as board president, developed a script that actually took about 5 to 10 minutes to read. It went over a lot of the scenarios that came up with people trying to speak more, over time, or to share their minutes, or all those sort of ways that they try to get around the limits of what we want to put in place. Happy to share that along with other people's scripts if that would be helpful. I do think it's important that we not only say, but we believe that everyone, whether they are in our community or coming from outside of our community, have the right to be heard. That is a fundamental aspect of how we do business in the United States. And it is critical because while, we might disagree with some of the speech now, in another time, another place, it's the opposite, right? So we want to make sure that everyone has the respect to be heard. And in doing so, they cannot disrupt the orderly business of the district. That's the key difference. So we want to make sure that you're fair to everyone, regardless of the substance of what they're saying. And the only time which you step in to constrain someone's expression is if that expression is disruptive to the meeting, not in its content, but in the way that it is expressed. So approaching the board, screaming, going over time, those sorts of things, those are the kind of things that would be disruptive regardless of content. And you should enforce that sort of content neutral approach in every situation. So even if someone is, someone's at the podium being very respectful, saying we shouldn't wear a mask, someone else stands up in the audience and yells at them, make sure you tell that person to stand down, just like you would regardless of content. And what, I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions which we can respond to, but the other thing I just want to talk to, and I say this both as a former board member and as someone who supports board members, and this has always been true, but I think it is particularly true now. Being a board member is a very isolating experience, even if you talk to your colleagues on the board. And you will hear information that makes you second guess what you're doing, either because you find it convincing, or maybe it's confusing, or it makes you second guess some of the recommendations from staff, any number of ways it can come to you. And it really is important to stay grounded in why you came to be on the board, what you hope to accomplish. Remember that you work with good people who are doing good work with kids, and that your colleagues, your neighbors may not remember to thank you or appreciate what you're doing. And in fact, you may never be thanked or appreciated for what it is that you're doing. But governing in a pandemic is probably the most important thing that we can do right now to help our kids stay safe, keep our kids in school, and keep them learning. And 10, 15, 20 years from now, no one may remember the work that you did at your board meeting this month or next month to keep the work of the board going, but it is critical to the benefit of the students both now and in the future that happened. And that can only come from you, or perhaps your spouse or partner or family, but it's not going to come from really anyone else external, and that is really difficult. And I struggled with that for a long time as a board member to recognize. So whatever it is that sort of motivates you and keeps you grounded and keeps you sort of where you are at, hold on to that and remember that while, even if no one is appreciating the work you're doing now, the work is critically important. And it cannot be overstated what benefit you are bringing to kids both now and into the future. And I'll turn it back over to Troy. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. We appreciate those remarks. And an important factor of controlling or managing meetings is not just what happens in the board meeting venue itself, but what happens outside and before the meeting. And to talk about that communications and community engagement component, we have with us Jerry Gallagher, partner with the Donovan Group, CSBA's partner for crisis communications.
Thank you, Troy. Good morning to everybody. And we are honored to be here, grateful to be here as a partner with CSBA. As Troy said, my name is Jerry Gallagher from the Donovan Group, which is a national communications firm that works exclusively with public schools, K through 12 schools, providing communications support. And there are a number of things that we could certainly talk about today. I'm going to share with you a document that we provided to CSBA that talks about communications. And many of these points that you'll see in these slides have already been covered very well by Dr. Bardach, Meg, Cindy, and Josh, and so I won't necessarily go through them individually, but I will, at a high level, talk about some of these things because I do think that they are important. And there are different classifications, and so before the meeting with respect to communications, it's important to review your policies, and it's something that has already been touched on. What can you do? How do you deal with visitors? How can access be limited if necessary? What are your policies? It's important to lean on policy in a situation like this when it can be contentious. Also, rules of order. I know that that's been touched on. Just anticipate that things won't go smoothly. I know that you're doing that already, but whenever that is the case, it's important to plan ahead, have meetings in advance, talk about what it is that you can do and how you can communicate with the public, and what is your chain of command for communications regarding public concerns or complaints. If there are issues raised about process before the meeting, what is that chain of command, chain of communications command? Also security questions and measures that you can talk about before the meeting. Who will maintain order? Is a sergeant at arms necessary? Is that something that will need to be addressed? Notifying law enforcement, collaborating with them. Have safe entry and exit points for school board members. That seems like something that we would never have to discuss, but it is, we believe, a point that should be clarified with your team before a meeting, in the event that it does become so unruly or hostile that you need to have school board members exit safely and quickly. Have leadership team members monitor social media. This is something I would like to talk about a little bit more in depth because this comes up all the time. Typically, we will see a notice of intent posted by someone on social media. They're trying to rally their troops, opponents of a certain issue. And so they will go on social media and make their point, their intent very clear about what it is that they plan to do at the school board meeting. And I've spoken with school board members who, after the fact, did not realize that this material was out there, these comments were out there publicly, and that they wish that someone would have notified them. They wish that they would have seen this in advance because it would have given them an opportunity to prepare. One thing that I'll say about this is that we have all kinds of committees as we work in the school stratosphere. One of the things that we discuss with the schools that we work with, is there a way to organize an informal, perhaps ad hoc social media watchdog committee of parents? I think it was Meg who talked about that supportive silent majority that you have. This is an opportunity to enlist that support, to be able to have some of these folks be monitoring social media for threats, for intentions, what it is that they plan to do, and to let people let people know in advance. And so that if you have to go through that chain of command that I talked about earlier, you can enact that as soon as possible. So that's one thing that I think is important. Another important point here, if we go to the next slide, is to work with the media and consider the media a partner of yours in a situation like this. And we have seen school board meetings go more smoothly in certain regions or parts of the country where the school district has, for lack of a better way of saying this, a stronger, better, more trusted relationship with the media. Because what will happen is if there's a media member there, you're taking a meeting that might be viewed by 30 to 50 people, and then that, whatever is said there, becomes magnified to the thousands of readers or listeners who are not in attendance. And so it's important to be able to have a conversation perhaps with a media member in advance about what it is you expect to have happen, or with the journalist after the meeting about, I know that this was said and this was brought up, but understand that these were the lion's share of the comments that were made, or here was the other business that we attended to during this meeting. And is there maybe a quiet space that you can offer a journalist to have an interview if it is a disruptive meeting, that the superintendent or possible trustees can meet with this journalist to have that conversation to maybe de-escalate not only the emotion of the meeting, but maybe the tone that that reporter felt while covering that meeting. And I can speak to this very personally because I spent 20 years as a journalist. And so I have that perspective of knowing when you're in the moment how that will be reported. And I think it's important to work as best you can to develop relationships with your local media to ensure that how it is a certain board meeting is reported on fairly and accurately. During the meeting, many of these things have been covered already. Having that sign-in sheet for those who would like to speak, establishing the norms for proper decorum, coaching leadership and board members to be intentional and not confronting emotion with emotion. Keep the focus on the why you were there. It's about the kids. It's about process. Lean into your strategic plan as much as possible if you can do that. The last thing I'll say before I turn this back over to Troy is that this is a broader topic, but I believe that this is very important as we not only act in the moment, but look to where we are going in the future in repairing and building further trust. And that is, are there ways that your school district, or ways in which your school district can be very intentional about communicating positive things that are happening in your district right now, today? Think about if you are a news viewer, and think about if you only hear negative news about community X, Y, or Z, then what is your perception going to be? The long-term rapport that you have with your community and trust is contingent upon them hearing the great things that are happening in your classrooms every single day. And the more that you can flood your platforms with very positive things that will serve you very well, and you'll have that collateral in place to be able to reach back into and grab and covet when a very contentious board meeting happens, and what very well might be a front page story, and that the community may gravitate to for a short period of time. But if they know, boy, I've read 3 or 4 stories, or I've been talking to people on the street and heard these great things that the district is doing, they'll have that as a foundation. A lot of that's subconscious. It's not necessarily a conscious thing that people will decide, but if you are embedding them with the real substance of your school district on a consistent basis, I think that will go a long way in helping you through this crisis. So with that point, I'll throw things back to Troy, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions about communications once we wrap up.
Thank you, Jerry. That's a great suite of strategies you have outlined. And I know you didn't go in depth. There's a lot more material there, and we will be getting that material out to the registrants of this event, as well as all CSBA members. Next, talk a little bit more about strategies for governance practice that can help in these difficult times. We have with us Terry Vigil, who has a dual role as a trustee in the Fall River Unified School District, which is composed of parts of Modoc, Lassen, and Shasta County. And her day job is as a governance educator and consultant with CSBA. Terry?
Thank you so much. Boy, what a wonderful webinar we've had so far. Again, my name is Terry Vigil. I've been a board member for 24 years in Fall River Unified School District. So really excited to be here. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk about is why we need to think about governance during crisis. We run for the board as an individual, but we govern as a team, right? So we really have to honor the team and the limitations of individual board member power, right? A strong governance team that abides by agreements upon norms and protocols are better able to handle the pressures during crisis. I always like to explain norms and protocols as the guardrail on the bridge, right? They keep us in check. Strong governance teams stand behind their decisions and use a collective voice for messaging. It's really important that we honor our protocol for communication as board members. We usually speak through the board president, and that's really important to not give 5 or 7 different messages coming from the governance team. The success of the team is a responsibility of each trustee, right? We have collective responsibility for making our governance team strong and giving the right message to our constituents. Next slide, please. Okay, an incident becomes a crisis when it traumatizes the system, erodes public confidence in the district, becomes hot news, disrupts the educational process, and has potential for financial loss from litigation. I think we've seen all 5 of these bullets the last 18 months, and we've endured these and definitely have been in the crisis mode a lot of the time. Next slide, please. So what is the board president's role in meeting management? I've had the pleasure of serving as the board president for about the last 5-6 years, so really excited about that and the opportunities that's given me to grow as a board member. But it's important that we realize that we are the facilitators. We are the ones that keep the meeting focused and in check. So it's important that we share the agreed upon meeting norms, including public comment at the beginning of the meeting, as our 2 previous board members have mentioned. And we invite the public to abide by meeting norms. A lot of times I like to advise boards to have their meeting norms up on the wall or copies at the table where people sign in for the meetings so they know what the expectation is. We make sure during public comment that trustees are not engaging with the public. Boy, as a new board member, that was one of the hardest things to learn, right? The 3 minutes is for them to address the board and not to engage in back and forth. And that's really difficult sometimes, but it's important for the decorum of the meeting to abide by that. We keep the focus of the meeting on the agenda and we complete the district's business, right? We are there to do the district's business. It's our meeting in public and we need to recognize that and really honor that. We acknowledge the fact that if there is a major disruption from the public at the meeting, a break may be called, or if it's serious enough, the room may be cleared. Our 2 previous board members have talked about that, and really, we are able to do that per the Brown Act if things get out of hand. Next slide, please. So the setup of the room is really important, and I love the horseshoe configuration where board members can see each other. So this works in two ways. It facilitates better discussion between board members, and it is a reminder that this is a school board's meeting in public. And that is really important, that we're able to see each other while we're deliberating and debating on action items on our agenda. We work with the superintendent to make sure that there are security measures in place to ensure safety for all. That's been discussed, and very important to have a plan in place if things get out of hand. Reminds the team to model decorum and civility and suggests this to the public attendees. You know, my board meetings lately have been pretty contentious, and it's really important that as board members that we reflect that decorum and not get out of hand as the meeting might. You know, we need to keep things calm, especially as board president. We hold the team and public accountable for following meeting norms, protocols, and policies, including your civility policy, if so adopted. There is a new board policy on civility. It's Board Bylaw 1313. So I'd like you to take a look at that if you can. It really supports the board meetings and shows a way to ensure decorum during your meetings. And I'd also like to announce that CSBA will be providing free regional trainings on governance through chaos virtually starting this month at no cost. So I'm really excited for that. And I'd like to thank each and every board member for the hard work that you do day to day. And I'd like to say, always keep the focus on the students and what's best for the students, and you'll never go wrong. Thank you, Troy, so much. I really enjoyed being here today.
Thank you, Terry. And last but not least, the man who has been patiently waiting in the wings, Keith Bray, General Counsel and Chief of Staff for CSBA.
Good morning. Well, you've already, let's go to the first slide, because you've already heard from our board members, our former board members, our communications expert that we have, that we've been working with, from Naomi at the Department of Public Health, to provide that foundation of the notion that this is your board meeting. And I appreciated Josh's comments about the respect that we all have for our First Amendment rights as a nation, and as those rights are practiced at our board meetings. But this is the code section in the Brown Act that clearly anticipates the situation where you're no longer able to conduct the business of the board. You're not able to approve that field trip, as we heard earlier. You're not able to, the resources that are coming in from our state and federal government to keep our kids in school this year, that's business that you all have to do. And if there is a willful interruption of your meeting, Brown Act provides that you may be able to conduct the meeting either in the room after it's cleared or elsewhere. Next slide, please. So always remember, this is a classic conflict of the constitutional right of free expression at a board meeting, with the ability to manage that free expression, and you're given that ability to do so, and expected to do so. We've already heard it today. Cindy talked about, well, we reduced the time from 5 minutes to 3 minutes for our public speaker. That's exactly the type of reasonable response to the situation that our board members are facing, that you are empowered to do. And what does disruption mean? Remember, it's just not hate speech. It's just not something where there might be gestures made, heckling taking place. It can also mean that the speech is going on too long. There's nothing in the Constitution that provides for endless board meetings. And this is what you've been elected, and again, already commented on, this is what you've been elected to decide. is how to conduct the public's business in a public meeting. So it's all up to you. I like this notion. We've kind of taken the analysis this morning from how to prepare for a board meeting. Josh talked about having a script, how to prepare, what you do during the board meeting. Next slide, please. And what you may do after the meeting in order to manage the message and really what went on. Now, this is just a leave behind in terms of kind of a sequence of what you do. And we've already heard from folks that have gone through it. That's why they're here. They've already had to go through board meetings that have had to be recessed, maybe even adjourned, right? And continued to another day. And you have a president. It's the president that typically heard to referred earlier, a sergeant of arms. It's the president that basically is directing traffic. And don't be shy with the gavel. Let the speaker know that their time is up. Cut the mic that we've heard, right? Let them know that there's other people that want to speak. And by their conduct, whether it's at the dais or their conduct in the boardroom, that might be interrupting the process. Remember, this is a meeting, but it's a governmental process. You are there to go from A to Z on your agenda. There's lots. Is there enough work for us all during the pandemic? There's lots to be done at our board meetings. And that's our message. Get the job done. Whatever you can do to try to tamp down the crowd, to give the people the time to speak, to move them forward. I like the names, here, the next two speakers are, because then they know if there's a speaker that's taking too much time, that speaker is taking time away from them. And remember, during our regular meetings, that's when you have your public comment period. Special meetings, only comments on the items that are on the agenda. You can recess the meeting and bring it back. If order has been restored, bring it back, continue the meeting. If it hasn't been restored, you clear the room and or you go to another room. It's all these things have been done. And why are they being done is so that the meeting can continue. And last but not least, it is a violation of the Penal Code, Section 403, to willfully disturb a public meeting. In some instances, maybe some, even those that have spoken this morning, would have liked a little bit more presence by law enforcement to help clear the room. I mean, we don't, staff aren't being put in harm's way. But I think another thing is this. Remember, it's just not distracting or disturbing speech, right? There has to be a substantial disruption. And there certainly has to be such a disruption for law enforcement to get involved. But if they get involved and they seriously address this issue, they seriously address outbursts in the courtroom, that's public unless it's closed. I know the forum's different, doesn't make a difference. Interruption is interruption. And we expect, don't we, that you all have been elected to serve and to take on these difficult issues, because that's why you've been elected. Others don't want that spot, especially if what's happening is these vociferous comments, the heckling, the threats that are coming from the audience. We take our business seriously, and would hope that others who we call upon to support our boards to help them take their business seriously would do the same. So this is, I think it's been, as previously mentioned, it really has been an A through Z treatment of what's going on out there and how to respond to what's going on out there in the event that your meeting becomes as disruptive and as chaotic as those that have spoken today. So now, with the time remaining, let's see if we can get to some questions.
Thank you, Keith. We appreciate that. We have quite a number of questions. I think some of them, or perhaps most of them, have been addressed during the course of this presentation, but there are some that we want to lift up. We will respond to questions we don't get to today in a later email. And the questions we're selecting are those which we think are most broadly applicable to the people who are watching today. So the first question that I want to raise up is from a member who wants to know if a board is dysfunctional, has poor board relationships, there's rubber stamping, not coming to meetings prepared, where do they begin to address and perform better so they can deal with these contentious board meetings? I think, Terry, that's in your wheelhouse.
Here we go. Okay, yes, that is definitely in my wheelhouse. I work with districts across the state of California, and I'm very pleased to do that. One way to strengthen your team is by creating a governance handbook and creating norms and protocols that you abide by. And really, as board members, we need to fix our own relationships between the team members. So I would suggest really looking at that governance handbook, looking at your norms and protocols, making sure that you are still abiding by those, and making sure your relationships are strong between members, and also looking into some GCS workshops if the need is there. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. We also had a number of questions regarding what constitutes disruption. Is heckling disruption? Is really long extended applause after a comment disruption? And then secondary to that, what options are available to the board if they feel someone needs to be removed? Is that something that a non-law enforcement professional like a security guard can do, or what are the rules around that? I think, Keith, I'll throw it to you.
Oh, I see that Josh, because I figured I see that Josh had his hand up.
Either of you legal eagles, jump in.
Sure, I'll tell you what. I'll back him. Go for it, Josh.
Go ahead, Keith. I can reinforce the brilliance that you're going to say.
Oh, here we go, back and forth. So what you can do, what is disruption? It has to be, so the heckling, if the heckling gets to the point where you can't go from one agenda item to the next, if it's engaging if the audience is engaging each other in the heckling, if you're not able to then have the speaker be able to speak to the board, that's a substantial disruption. And those that have been in those meetings can speak to that. Just remember, it has to be substantial. You can't get to your business done. There's a case where there was a Nazi salute at a meeting, but it was a question of law whether that was a disruption because none of the board saw it. So even though we know that's not what we teach in school, we teach in school to put our hands on our hearts. But was that enough of a disruption? Did the meeting go on, or were they just perturbed at the viewpoint that was being expressed? So you really have to have a disruption where you can't continue the meeting. Josh?
Thank you, Keith. So, if there is some heckling, my suggestion is practically would be to reiterate what you said at the beginning of the meeting from your script, which is if this continues, we'll need to shut it down, right? So that you've given them a warning. If it continues, you can take a 5 or 10 minute recess, and as I think Meg said earlier on, make it serious. And then if it continues again, you say, okay, look, if this continues, we're going to need to basically do something more dramatic or more substantial. And at this point, my recommendation, certainly if you feel comfortable with bringing in law enforcement or someone else to clear the room, you can do that. You have to allow members of the media to stay in the room. But under the current executive order, you can simply just go to Zoom. And I actually think that is a much cleaner solution than needing to bring in anyone to sort of physically enforce a clearing of the room. At the Oakland School Board meeting on August 11th, we put in, at the beginning of every agenda, there's a long notice description that we added, and we explicitly say if there is a disruption that is substantial, that the board reserves the right to resume on Zoom. And it says it will start within, no earlier than 1 hour after the disruption occurred. So on August 11th, that actually happened. We moved back to Zoom. And so I would say that is a simpler solution than needing to come in and clear the room, at least, in most parts of California. There can always be pushback on how that clearing of the room is done that may not reflect well on those who are doing the clearing of the room. I also want to note that there's a question, I believe, about AB 361. So that was passed by the legislature on Friday. It now goes to the governor's desk. That would more or less allow for the continuation of Zoom meetings, but you would need to make certain findings by the board.
And can you elaborate on what those findings would be?
There has to be an imminent, the board has to find that meeting in person would create an imminent danger to health and safety.
Key point. Thank you, Keith. There are a number of questions here on particulars about COVID and how you can manage that. I don't believe that Dr. Bardach is still with us, but we will get answers from California Health and Human Services and CDPH. I know there's more detailed questions about dealing with the virus. Similar, there's some questions on CRT. Not enough time to delve into that, but we will get those questions to you separately. So we're going to focus on the governance angle for the rest of this webinar. And one of those questions involves whether involves around what can you do beforehand to kind of mitigate some of the hostility or the contentiousness so that board meetings go more smoothly. I don't know if Jerry, you want to speak to that?
I'll let Cindy go first. I'll fill in.
I was just going to say, again, be proactive in your district in telling the positive news of what's going on, as well as educational pieces. Our superintendent does a lot of press releases to keep the community and the parents, and it's sent through our parent square to every single parent and employee. Updates on COVID. She created a COVID dashboard for our district to answer questions about what kind of cases are in our district. And then we created the spotlight news for each school, for each part of our cabinet, whether it's Director of Educational Services or Special Ed. And again, they give information and positive news about programs, about what's going on. Yay, we reclassified whatever, 100 kids. And so by creating those stories, the board can act when you're stopped at the grocery store or whatever, you have the information to combat misinformation and to reinforce the information that's coming from your district. So a lot of communication, lots and lots on all these different pieces of information. Another thing, one more thing, sorry, that our board does, we have board signups to responsibilities to go to different community organization meetings. So like we have a government affairs committee in Lake Arrowhead, we have Rotaries, we have a RIM Educational Foundation. We go to these meetings and we give a little report about the school district. So it enables us to give out information and educate community organizations, but we also say little positive stuff so that they can go and feel really, really happy about their only school district.
I would echo, I think that Cindy's spot on right there. This is maybe a small thing, but it can be a big thing. It's a way that school districts will make use of their app, which goes beyond their school district, the parents and those stakeholders, but to your broader community. Send out the agenda, send out maybe a story or two highlighting what things you really want to focus on in that board meeting when the agenda is completed. My only concern about that, and I've talked to school districts, is if they have a Monday meeting, many times they'll do that on Friday. They'll send that out to the entire community on Friday, and I think that that's a no-no, because as a journalist for 20 years, we always classified it as the Friday news dump. That's where stories go to die, and that's a lot of times corporations will release bad news, bad corporate earnings reports, those kinds of things. That Friday's just not a good day to communicate. So do it on a Sunday if, in fact, you have that ability to do so. And then you want to be proactive following the meeting as well. Always proactive and not reactive, and own the messaging. So if you have a templated news release ready to go that you can kind of fill in the gaps shortly after that meeting has ended, that you're essentially beating everybody else to the punch and you're owning your story, I would encourage you to do so as well.
Thank you. We also had a number of questions regarding the difference between guidance and requirements and actual laws. A number of board members reported they're experiencing people coming to meetings who are not complying with the masking requirements in that locality, and they want to know, what enforcement options are available to them. They're receiving comments from people saying that they are not required to abide by these regulations. And I was wondering if Keith or Josh, you could speak to that.
I'll let Josh go first on this one. Unmute yourself, Josh.
Sorry, Troy, I was looking through the questions. Which specific question were you asking about?
I was sort of compiling 3 different questions into one, but there are a number of members who reported that people are coming to board meetings in defiance of social distancing or masking requirements for those localities and saying they are not required to comply with those rulings, that it's the
during the meeting. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, just when you start the meeting, make sure you have a sign that says, mask is required for attendance. Do your script at the beginning. Then you end your script and you say, I noticed there are people in the audience without masks. If people do not leave or do not put their mask on, we'll have no choice but to go back to Zoom. And you're basically saying, look, it's up to you. And if you choose to maintain this behavior, we understand, and we have a responsibility to keep our board members, our staff, and our community safe. And this is how we're doing it. And we understand that you disagree, but that's not that's not something we're going to debate here. These are the rules. And you will get heckled for going to Zoom. You will get heckled for retreating and leaving. But you have a responsibility, not just legally, but morally and ethically, to keep people safe. And the guidance is very clear that masks help, and that we are allowed to require masks in an indoor setting. And that's that. And then if they refuse, then you go to Zoom.
Right. You have that ability. I mean, if you have so be prepared for another room is what Josh is suggesting with going to Zoom, being prepared just to basically leave the boardroom and go someplace else to conduct the meeting. If you have that ability at where you're having the meeting.
We have a couple questions related to threats. Specifically, does a threat against a trustee in and of itself qualify as
Should I take that one too, Troy, or somebody else?
What's the question? Would it be absolutely? At that point, you need to deal with that individual. Josh, I'm sure you've been in situations where and others here have been in situations where threats have been made at the meeting against the personal safety of the board.
I will note that there are some threats that are very specific. Director Daniels, we're going to come after you and your family, right? And then there are threats that are a lot more amorphous, and those are often the threats that you hear. We're going to come after all of you, or something more like
criminals.
Right? And that's exactly, you're criminals, or you're going to get what's coming to you, or whatever, right? And that is a lot trickier to handle because they're not specific, they're not directed at a particular person, and so I would say that in the moment, unless it is very clear that they name a person and name a particular threat, I would not recommend addressing it in the moment. I would consult with counsel afterwards, and then if you need to send a letter or follow up somehow with local law enforcement, you can do so. But usually, if you try to, get in somebody's face or respond at the board meeting, it ends up being a huge distraction and a digression from the focus of the board meeting. Most of the people who are there want attention, and you give them attention by challenging them rather than going about and focusing on the business of the board. You want boring board meetings. You don't want exciting board meetings.
And then a related question, sort of a follow-up. Can the district remove personal attacks on social media, or is that in violation of the Brown Act because these are considered public records, I think is what they're trying to imply?
All right, I'll just jump in.
Where they posted? I'm a little confused. Are you talking about
The question specifically mentioned social media, but I think many districts are also allowing people to electronically submit questions. And I think in that case, since it's administered by the district, it's a little bit more of a gray area whether that's a public record and the district would be allowed to remove it.
So if the district has like a Facebook page and there's an attack on a board member on the Facebook page, for example, so a personal attack like, you know, Josh, you're an awful board member, that should not be removed unless you remove all comments, because that would be a content-driven removal. You know, we are, not anymore for me, but all board members are public officials, and you should expect to be attacked for what you do and criticized and called names, etc. And so a simple criticism, if in flowery language, is not a basis to deny someone their right to speech. That being said, if it is a threat, or if you refuse all attacks, you know, regardless of content, then you can do that. But you have to be careful that you're not removing something, again, as long as it's not threatening, on the basis of the content of that speech.
Great. And we are now 5 minutes past our scheduled time to adjourn. So that will be the final question. Again, I apologize that we couldn't get to more, but this is a rich topic. I think it's very likely we will have future webinars and we will respond to those other questions in writing. So I want to thank our panelists for joining us today and sharing such valuable information. If you are a viewer or a registrant of this event, you will receive both the PowerPoint deck as well as a link to the recorded version of the webinar, so you can watch this later at your leisure. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We wish you luck in your governance endeavors and hope to see you again soon. Take care.